A Leica 35mm f2 Summicron is one of those aspirational lenses that Leica people would like to own one day. These lenses are small, compact, they look good, they're well built, and they're known as some of the best glass that you can buy. But with this Leica Summicron f2 ASPH 2, or I think it's often called the version 6, coming in at around $3,500, is this really worth it when there are so many other really good options out there? I have some potentially controversial thoughts on this, so let's get started. When I first bought this Leica M262, I bought the smallest, cheapest little Voigtlander lens that I could find. And that was the Voigtlander 35mm color Scopar f2.5. And I got that because it was well respected, it was affordable, and it was very small. But in my first ever review of the Leica M, someone said in the comments that I should try to get Leica glass and my experience will be better. Even though the experience of using that little Voigtlander lens was pretty much exactly what I was looking for anyways. But I still had that sort of itch to have a Leica lens. So here I am, let's see. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm not the most technical expert at reviewing camera lenses, but I have used enough gear and spent enough time considering the gear that I'm using to have a fairly solid perspective. I also got this lens from lens rentals, partially with my own money and partially with some credit that was left over from a previous rental. And so if you are interested in a lens like this, follow the link in the description, use the code Liam15, you'll get 15% off of your order at lens rentals. Using that link supports this channel, so thank you very much in advance for using the link. So let's talk about the Leica 35mm Summicron f2 ASPH 2. Starting with the size, as you can see, it's a nice small compact lens, and so are all of the 35mm Summicrons that you'll find for Leica. But I will say that this one is a little bit bigger than the older versions of it, and that's common. We see lenses getting a little bit bigger, maybe as they're cramming more optical technology into them. However, that doesn't make it a large lens at all, although it is probably about the same size with the hood on as the 35mm Summa Lux, the 1.4 version. But if we take the hood off, you can see it's quite a bit smaller, and it even has a filter on there making it slightly larger looking. It also balances really nicely on this M262. If I hold the camera by its strap, it sits pretty much perfectly level. It doesn't lean forward as it would if the lens was too heavy, or lean slightly backwards as it does when there's no lens on here, or if it has the Voigtlander color Scopar on here, it leans backwards slightly because the Scopar's too small and light. So that's a plus. I like this balance that it has. And that seems like a silly thing, but I do actually notice it carrying it around. Holding the lens on its own, the weight does seem to be focused towards the back of the lens, which helps with the balance and how it feels on the camera. And it's actually, because even though it's so small, you'd be surprised at how heavy it actually feels. It's quite a dense lens. It's probably one of the best feeling lenses that I've used in terms of build quality. And even just putting on the lens hood makes it feel like a precision built product. It stops perfectly in the spot it needs to be. Now, this being a rental copy, it has seen a little bit of use, and I can't see it moving, but I can feel a tiny bit of play back and forth in the aperture ring. That's something that I notice on the Voigtlander lens I have, but it's all that's visible in that lens. This one, just, I can sort of feel a click, but I can't see it moving. And it also stops down just slightly past f16, you can see there, which isn't really a problem. Sometimes at f16 I want to make the aperture smaller, so having that tiny little drop is okay, and it does move the aperture at that point as well. I don't know if you'll be able to see that on the camera though. And all of these things could be from wear and tear, but I don't know, it's just what this copy is like. And I looked for these kind of things for the sake of this review, so there's a good chance that if I bought this and just used it, I wouldn't even have noticed. Ultimately, nothing feels wrong with this lens. Sticking with the aperture ring, I heard some reviewers say that their Summicron's aperture ring was easy to bump, and while this moves easy enough, I think the clicks are solid enough that I've never had any problems accidentally bumping it. Maybe if my finger was in the wrong space on the focus tab, I could accidentally drag it, but the way I hold the camera, I've never noticed it, and I mean, I've only been using it a week or so, so that might change, but this feels fine to me. I've already talked about how it's balanced, but the balance of the lens does actually help with the ergonomics. There's something about putting it on my shoulder and carrying it around like this that is comfortable. Any other like DSLR or anything like that tips down at the front. They don't have this same balance, and weirdly makes a difference carrying it around. In terms of just the feel of the lens, the focus tab is very prominent, feels very comfortable, and it has these little things on the edge here where if you just want to pinch it, I don't think it's actually focusing on that, but if you prefer to pinch the focus tab than have your finger inside the notch, you can do so, and it's got a little grippiness to it, so that's kind of nice. I do really like how smoothly and easily the focus tab moves. There's a little bit of resistance there, so it's not just like, you know, falling around and feeling very, very loose. It's got this less resistance than Voigtlander lens, but not so much that it's just completely freely wobbling back and forth. I think ultimately Leica found the perfect balance of resistance in this focus tab. One thing that I might miss from the Voigtlander lens that I have is the little tabs on the side of the aperture ring. So I can be looking through the rangefinder and get a feel for where my aperture is. So I know that, like, if they were on perfectly in the middle on either side, I'm at like aperture 5.6. So that might be something I miss, but I just tend to look down at the aperture anyways and not change it too much, so it's not really a problem. And maybe if there was those little things on the side, I would end up actually bumping the aperture more. So I don't know if this is a plus or a negative with ergonomics, it's just something I've noticed that's different. So the manual focus experience of the Leica M lenses and a rangefinder camera. I think people often scoff at the Leica M because it's such an expensive luxury item with none of the modern conveniences of cameras, and it doesn't make sense for most people, particularly people who are working professionally. And in most cases, these people are probably right. There's not necessarily a tangible, practical reason for having one of these cameras and lenses, but not necessarily always. I actually really like the Leica M system for street photography, and the manual focus on the lenses is, for me, faster and more convenient than any autofocus lens I've ever used. There's a reason that it remains so popular among street photographers, other than we are just posers and hipsters, which can also be true. So, one of my favorite things about these Leica M lenses is the distance scale on the top. With the focusing tab set to 6 o'clock, the lens is focused at 3 feet. Pull it 45 degrees to the left side, and it's a little over 2.5 feet. 45 degrees to the right side, and it's at 10 feet. And at f11, 10 feet will give you about 5.5 feet to almost infinity of depth of field. Now look at that, as I'm doing it, I actually set it to 12, but whatever. And with a little bit of practice, you can get used to moving your finger to where it needs to be to fit the focus distance scale just how you want it. And there, I'm just probably at 11 feet, to be honest. So this for me makes that manual focus lens faster than any other autofocus lens I've ever used, and my overall experience shooting street photography is one that's much faster with much less things to think about. And while you can use manual focus on plenty of other lenses, there's something about the way that these are built that just makes it easier for my hands to find the spots that I need to. For example, if I'm using like a Canon EF lens, the amount that you move the lens is absolutely minuscule, and there's no tab. So there's not enough readings on the lens like this, as there would be in most old film cameras from back in the day when manual focus was just the norm. So this method for me makes manual focus by far the fastest way to focus for street photography, and removes the thought of, is this going to be in focus, from my head. Okay, so image quality is really where the Leica Summicron lens shines. The rendering with this lens is so good that people complain it's too clinical and it's maybe gone too far. than compared to the older Leica lenses. There's maybe a touch of vignette in it about f2, but it goes away quickly as you start to stop down. And from edge to edge, from wide open to stopped all the way down, the lens doesn't really seem to have any aberrations. It's sharp in the corners. It just does everything you can throw at it, and that's why Leica glass seems to be held up in such high regard as the best that you can buy. The only lens that I actually own for my Leica is the Voigtlander 35 Color Scope R f2.5. So pitting the Summicron against that lens was no contest. The Summicron is the better lens across the board. It's even better than many of the similar lenses on the market, including my 35mm 1.4 that I use on Canon cameras for shooting weddings. And that lens is amazing too, and you can find it for less than $1,000, maybe find it for about $600 or $700 nowadays. So is this Summicron really $2,000 to $3,000 better than other comparable lenses out there? Probably not for me, especially when I use the Voigtlander in bright conditions and round about f11. Even though the Summicron is, a stop better at light transmission, has the f2 aperture compared to 2.5, doesn't have the vignetting, is probably a little bit sharper, controls flare a lot better, it can make the Summicron feel far easier to shoot with in many more lighting conditions. So if pure image quality, especially wide open, is your thing, maybe the price tag for the Summicron won't deter you all that much. Over the years, I've owned and tried a lot of lenses and cameras, but I would always hear about this Leica Look, and you had to have a Leica with a Leica lens in order to achieve the Leica Look. And I'm no expert in this, but kind of been skeptical that that's a real thing. I've never looked at anyone's photos and thought, that looks like a Leica picture. I've heard some people maybe attribute it to a shallow depth of field with a beautiful color and bokeh rendering, but I also know that you could also get those two things from just about any other camera manufacturer out there. And I certainly didn't specifically find any kind of Leica Look from using the 35mm Summicron either. So ultimately, I feel like the Leica Look might actually be in the eye of the beholder, and I don't think I care enough about it to pay enough attention to the image quality to look for the Leica Look in my pictures. But one thing that I do believe is that a great photo without the Leica Look is definitely going to be better than a mediocre photo with the Leica Look. And when it comes down to it, having whatever this Leica Look is won't really have any bearing on the perceived quality of your pictures outside of yourself and maybe the Leica Look community. So this comment that I referenced earlier in the video is just one sentence without any wider context from this person, and they clearly had a better experience with Leica glass, it sounds like, and at least compared to me. And that little Voigtlander was working so well for me at the time and doing exactly what I needed it to do and what I imagined it would do when I was shooting with it. And the functionality is so similar to Leica lenses that I couldn't imagine that a Leica lens would necessarily give me a better experience. Well, it is better, but not much better. It's really quite a similar experience. This is bigger, it feels nicer, it feels of a higher quality, and the Voigtlander lens is just a smaller version of that. It's a little bit fiddly for some people, but I find it okay. And that was really it for the experience. It feels nicer on the camera. That's the end of my experience. But overall, the image quality is objectively better, and that's great. But the Voigtlander is perfectly sharp and looks great where I need it to be. And where the Voigtlander falls short, I have other cameras that I prefer to use in those conditions anyways. Ultimately, there's an intangible element of using Leica glass and Leica cameras in general. It's something fancy, it's something that's out of reach for most of us for a lot of time. It's something aspirational, it's a Rolex, it's a Bentley, it's a BMW. It's a luxury good that makes us feel special whether we acknowledge it or not. And it is also a tool that can do the job very well. There are other tools out there that can do essentially the same thing, just a slightly different experience in doing it. For example, I found I could manual focus the X100V in a very similar way to this camera, and it improved my experience with the X100, but I still wanted this specific manual focus experience and I enjoy this better. But I can get the same thing with the X100 and I found it more versatile in more situations. But if I had the choice, I would still reach for a Summicron. And it's important to remember before we sink too much of our money into expensive camera gear that most of the world's best pictures were made on lenses far inferior to the Leica 35mm Summicron, especially the newer ASPH version 2 or Summicron version 6 model. So ultimately, I'm not going to keep this. When the day comes that I could burn $3,500 in my backyard and my life wouldn't be any different, then maybe I'll treat myself to a nice expensive lens like this. I'm sure there'll be a very different model out by that time. Maybe I would go for a slightly older one that was $2,000 worth. Until then, I'm going to keep using the little Voigtlander lens instead. As I mentioned before, this lens came from Lens Rentals, and if you're interested in trying out a new piece of camera gear, which I recommend you do before you spend $3.5 grand on it, use the link in the description, use the code Liam15, you'll get 15% off your order. And this is not a paid ad, but they do send me their gear to use and make videos for this channel, and I like their service. They send the lens sometimes a day or two in advance, which is nice, and you send it back, it's all packaged up, it's super easy, and I would recommend it to anybody who's even thinking about buying a new camera or lens. And sometimes you can also buy them from Lens Rentals if you just want to keep the thing that you rented. Alright, I think that is it for this one. Thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop me a comment down below, let me know what you thought, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.